Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, tonight we are opening a case that is over a century old. But the suspect on trial was only recently raised as a serious contender as Jack the Ripper. So could the carman, Charles Allen Lechmere, who identified himself as Charles Cross, who was the person who is said to have discovered the body of Polly Nichols, instead of being an innocent witness seeing something horrifying, could he be Jack the Ripper himself? Well, let's put it to the pub test. Now, before I dive into the trial itself, I just have to state why I'm covering this particular topic now. It has been put forth to me that I really need to do this full deep dive into the theory that Krista Holgram put out in the book Cutting Point. And I've been holding off for a couple of reasons. One, I sort of wanted some input from Krista Holgram himself, which doesn't seem to have happened. So I'm pressing forward anyway. But also from my own point of view, I was always interested in the Jack the Ripper saga, and maybe about 10, 15 years ago, I sort of stopped really reading books on it and so forth. And then just in the last couple of years, when I started this YouTube channel, I just started going back into it. And it really surprised me that all of a sudden, the person I knew as Charles Cross, the person who saw Polly Nichols in Bucks Row, all of a sudden was a serious suspect. And not only that, if any suspect on this list could possibly lead to absolute vitriol from both sides, it was this bloke. And I'm thinking, how? Why? And initially when I was doing this channel, I really didn't understand the depth and complexity to this particular theory. And trust me, I have put a fair bit of time into looking at it. So in this video, I will be convincing you that Charles Lechmere is Jack the Ripper, and at the same time I'm going to be convincing you that Charles Cross is not Jack the Ripper. And yes, I did intentionally use both of his surnames here. But at the end of it all, well, it'll go out to the jury. You, the viewer, will be the jury. And I don't expect everyone to agree. I will, at the end of it, give my personal opinion, but then we get to see what everyone else thinks. But at the start of any trial, the defense and prosecution will have a sheet of paper which they say are agreed facts. The reason for that is there's no need to waste time and resources arguing something that is either immaterial to the case or you both have the same opinion on. So we will touch on some agreed facts that I think everyone, no matter which side of this argument you stand, would just have to say, well, it's true. Firstly, that Charles Cross / Lechmere could be Jack the Ripper. And what do I mean by that? I'm not saying that right now that he is. That's what the trial is for. But the fact that it's potentially possible. See, back in the day, we're not looking at this case from the investigation from 130 odd years ago. We're looking at it from today's perspective with what we know now and what the evidence actually shows. Because the police really were a little bit hamstrung in their investigation of Jack the Ripper. Because they were looking for someone who was most likely gay. They were looking for someone who was not only gay but probably foreign. And not only that, they were some type of monstrous person. Some deranged individual similar to Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. The Mr. Hyde part of that. Someone that just couldn't control themselves and would appear like absolutely outside of society. In fact, the term degenerate was first being coined during this time in the 1880s, or probably a little bit before, as the theory of evolution was coming in. People said, well, this Jack the Ripper person has to be a degenerate. In other words, someone not fully evolved. A throwback to our more primal instincts. Now, as science has progressed, we understand that that's just not the case. There is not really such a degenerate type of person, though we still use the term, and that's where it comes from. But we also know that serial killers don't fit that mold of what we want them to be. And what I mean by that is that the people back, like the British people living in around the Whitechapel area and probably all of London, did not want to think that the perpetrator could have been a family man who's married to a woman who has children and has steady employment. Because that just wouldn't have fitted. They wanted it to be something that they couldn't get their head around. And then they could say, see, it's not one of us. But as a follower of true crime, you would know that that really isn't often the case when we come to these serial perpetrators. How many of them are family men with jobs? And the last person you would expect to be performing such hideous actions. And so for that reason, we have to accept the fact that Charles Lechmere makes this list, despite the normalcy in his life. Because these serial perpetrators are able to compartmentalize their lives. They can act a certain way around the family, but then act out their other things away from them. And the second agreed fact is, well, he was actually there. Unlike many suspects that get raised, we can agree that Charles Lechmere was on the scene. So during this, when I'm doing the defense part of it, I'll be raising some theories or ideas that maybe I don't believe fully myself, but I mean, a good defense lawyer will basically try and cast suspicion on anyone else other than their client. So I'll be doing a bit of that. But also, I won't be prosecuting the Thames Torso murders as part of this. Even though I know as part of the bigger theory, it's suggested that Charles Lechmere is both Jack the Ripper and the Thames Torso murderer. My point there is, I think this video series would go on for a long time if I was covering that as well. But I feel that if I can't prove that he's Jack the Ripper, then there's no need to go after him for these other crimes. It's sort of like what the prosecution would do in real life, the cost to benefits. If we can nail him for Jack the Ripper, then do we need to pursue the others? But if you've just stumbled across this video and you are new to the pub test, well, absolutely welcome. I really hope you enjoy this video. But for that reason, I'll just give a brief rundown on the history of the Jack the Ripper crimes. There's a lot of information out there, so this is only an overview, but in 1888 in Whitechapel, it's an area in London, some terrible atrocities were happening to women. Now, these women were known as unfortunates because their lifestyle is not really the right word, but their circumstances in life is more to the point, where they fell on hard times for various reasons, and then the only way to make money and survive was, and for most of them this is the case, occasionally going out on the streets, seeking men for company, and the men would pay them the money. But because they were doing those things, it made them vulnerable, as it still would today if you were engaged in that occupation. But during this time in 1888, a series of attacks became known as the Autumn of Terror. And primarily, over time, it was considered that there were 5 canonical victims of one particular serial perpetrator, who towards the end of this reign of terror became known as Jack the Ripper, and that name has stuck throughout history since. And the first victim was found in Bucks Row, being Polly Nichols. And then Annie Chapman was found in Hanbury Street. Elizabeth Stride was found in Dutfield's Yard, almost 3 weeks after the Annie Chapman attack. But that very night, on the double event, Catherine Eddowes was found in Mitre Square. And then it went quiet for a while, right up until early November, when in Miller's Court, Mary Kelly was attacked in her room, and that was the most brutal of all the crimes. And then it said, following that, Jack the Ripper disappeared. And as I stated earlier, in more recent times it has been suggested that Charles Lechmere, Charles Cross, a person that comes into this story at the very start, could have been that particular person. Well, let's now put this person on trial. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, whilst we don't have the suspect here before us, because that opportunity is long past, we are here today to prove that Charles Lechmere was one of the most sadistic, evil people ever to walk this earth. And the tragedy of it all is he's almost got away with it all. But what we do know of Jack the Ripper is two concrete things. He had to have had the opportunity to do the crimes. And to get away with them, with all the police in force, all the vigilance committees who were hunting him down, he also needed intimate local knowledge of the streets, so that once performing a crime, he could then just disappear. And possibly have family that he could duck into. Unsuspecting family who would not know the actions that he was doing. Well, such a man was Charles Lechmere. During this autumn of terror, Charles Lechmere resided at 22 Doveton Street near Whitechapel, but he worked over at Pickford's, which was close to a 30 to 40 minute walk away. He worked as a carman, which was a delivery driver. He walked to work every morning. And if we bring up the map, if you can see that map, dotted are various attacks, not just the 5 canonical victims, but others as well. And as we see, they are so close together. But interestingly, Doveton Street is on one side of that, and Pickford's is on the other side. And so, Charles Lechmere walked these very, very streets, worked around these streets all the time. So if one person had the opportunity and had the local knowledge, it is Charles Lechmere. Well, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, as the defense for this person, I have to say, let's look at that map. The prosecution want to make a thing of it. Well, we note all these crimes did happen around each other, plus others. Except I would ask you particularly to look at the map of the double event. Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes. What do we see there? Well, it is actually not on his way to work. He would not have walked past there. He would have had to have taken a massive detour to have performed those crimes. And it's that double event probably happened on a day he wasn't working. So are they now suggesting that, well, he had a day off, so he thought he would go out and do a bit of murder? You're talking a bloke who's working 6 days a week, 12-hour days, and on his rest day, well, that's what he's motivated to go out and do. Now, I don't know about you, but to me, that just seems a little bit fanciful. And to say, and the way the prosecution suggested it, he could be the only person that could have done this, the only person with the opportunity and the local knowledge. Well, we're going to see that's definitely not the case. And what also proves it, there's an eyewitness that will get discussed quite extensively in this trial, but Robert Paul, he'd never met Charles Lechmere, but he also walked to work every morning, and yet they crossed each other one morning, that fateful morning, August 31st, when Polly Nichols was found in Bucks Row. That's the first time they met each other. There were thousands of people walking to work at that time. So I really hope that the prosecution has a little bit more evidence than just opportunity and local knowledge. Well, I would like to thank my esteemed colleagues from the defence, but I will point out that there were not thousands of people in Bucks Row on August 31st when Polly Nichols was found brutally murdered. But I will say that the actions of Charles Lechmere was not one of an innocent eyewitness, but they were cold, they were calculating, and as said before, absolutely evil. Just consider, he first turns up and acts like a concerned citizen. He calls over another passerby, brings them over to the body and says, "Look what's happened here." And they're the actions that you would expect of someone to do. But then he doesn't want to touch the body. Then he says, "Well, I'm late for work. It's time for us to go." So both the gentlemen who found the body take off. And then when they do see a police officer, Charles Lechmere says, "Well, we don't know if she's dead." Well, if you didn't know the person had passed away, why aren't you offering assistance? Now that, dare I say it, does not pass the pub test. He also says to PC Misen, who he ran into in Hanbury Street, and remember Hanbury Street for later in this trial, but Robert Paul and Charles Lechmere go up Bucks Row into Hanbury Street, run into this police constable, and it's Charles Lechmere who says there's a policeman waiting for you back in Bucks Row. Now PC Misen is under the impression that it was the policeman that sent these two jokers up the street. And so PC Misen then doesn't think to get any details. He doesn't think to detain them because, maybe they've got questions to answer. He's under the assumption that it's the police constable back in Bucks Row that found the body, which means Charles Lechmere is able to continue on. And it's safe to say the way Charles Lechmere conducted himself, PC Misen wasn't alarmed. He was under the impression the situation was under control and he would get there very shortly. But there was no need for him to rush off. And so Charles Lechmere is able to disappear into the London fog. Or at least he would have if it wasn't for Robert Paul. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I am just saying that my colleagues there from the prosecution do raise a good point about Robert Paul, but we will get back to him. Firstly, what was PC Misen doing in Hanbury Street? Well, he was knocking people up. Now, I know that's going to sound a bit strange to people in North America and in the English-speaking parts of the Southern Hemisphere, but in the UK it means something totally different. It means you were knocking on people's doors to wake them up so they could get to work. And apparently that was a little bit of a paid job you could do. So it looks like PC Misen, well, he was sort of double dipping here. He had a bit of a side hustle, not just walking the streets, but at that time of the morning when people are getting up ready for work, that's what he was doing in Hanbury Street, knocking on a few doors to get people going. And so PC Misen's account of what actually happens is very interesting. Oddly, he really only mentions one person approaching him in Hanbury Street, and that person, it would generally appear to be Charles Lechmere. It's like Robert Paul wasn't even there. And when Charles Lechmere, who did identify himself as Cross at the inquest, said, "I never told PC Misen there was a policeman in Bucks Row. I said, there's a body back in Bucks Row and you are wanted." I'm suggesting to you, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, that PC Misen was distracted. He was worried about making his extra cash by knocking on doors to get people off to work. So he did not pay that much attention to these two. And that, when that's brought up at the inquest, that's really not challenged. Like, one juryman does ask the person who identified himself as Charles Cross, what did you exactly say to the police constable? But then it's just this dropped. Now, if PC Misen really believed that Charles Lechmere had have mentioned a police officer was waiting for him, I think more of a deal would have been made of it back then. And in illustrations in papers of this particular event in Hanbury Street, they only show one person running up to the police constable, not two. But it was Robert Paul that started giving interviews to newspapers, and in those interviews he was making it seem like he was the primary person involved in this entire event. Yet oddly, Robert Paul goes missing. Charles Cross puts his hand up and says, I was that bloke in Bucks Row. Robert Paul's nowhere to be found. They have to hunt him down. It takes 2 weeks to find him, and they only get him to the inquest after the second attack done by Jack the Ripper. So I put it to you, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, that was it Robert Paul who perhaps performed that crime? Was it him who went into Bucks Row first, attacked Polly Nichols, heard someone coming, goes up the street in the dark a little bit, and then turns back and goes to walk past, and then gets dragged over by a concerned citizen, being my client, Charles Lechmere, and he makes sure that he touches the body? Because if there was blood on his hands, then that could easily be explained away. Charles Lechmere doesn't want to touch the body. But being the concerned person he is off to work. But he sees a policeman and runs up. That's why PC Misen really only recognised one person, and he says that person's in trouble back there. I'm not sure if she's dead. Because it's possible that it was Robert Paul who had only just attacked that poor woman. But Robert Paul, knowing what he had done, says no, she's definitely gone. Now, I'm not saying that for sure that that's how it happened, but I could easily see how it could have happened that way. And therefore, you must have reasonable doubt about the guilt of Charles Lechmere. Well, I think my colleagues from the defence are showing their desperation by basically trying to pin this on someone like Robert Paul. Typical tactic, anyone but my client. So before too long, they'll be pulling in the whole clown show of suspects, people that probably were not even near London at the time, just to confuse the issue. But make no mistake, PC Misen, and there is good evidence to show that was told that a policeman was waiting for him back in Bucks Row. And there's a good reason also as to why we can prove that. Now, PC Misen is not around to defend himself, but Charles Lechmere would have known the police beats. He was very familiar with the streets. He walked to work every morning and was doing so for 20 years up to this point. So it was no doubt he would have known that a policeman was soon to enter Bucks Row. Now, we will get into that interaction with Robert Paul later in this trial. But at that stage, he would have known the amount of minutes roughly he had before he needed to be away from that scene. But making it out of Bucks Row and then around into Hanbury Street and running into a police officer, Charles Lechmere could have confidently said, there's a policeman waiting for you back there, knowing full well that a policeman would have arrived, which they did. And so when PC Misen comes around to Bucks Row, there is a debate about who signalled who. We are not 100% sure, because both of them could have been thinking that they were signalling each other, because the policeman coming around the corner may not have got to the body at the point that PC Misen came into Bucks Row. But for that reason as well, no doubt Charles Lechmere was running to the police officer. He wanted to make sure that it was him that told the story. And that's why, to PC Misen, only one person stood out. And Hanbury Street itself plays a significant part in this particular trial, and also about the story of Charles Lechmere and why that particular crime happened. But I know the defence are going to raise a very crucial point. Did not Charles Lechmere present himself to the inquest less than 3 days after this attack on Polly Nichols? Well, yes, he did. And they made a good point that Robert Paul was missing. They had to go find him. But the question is, why? Why did Charles Lechmere come forward? Well, could you imagine him sitting down to read the newspaper, and here is this person who he thought was probably not that smart, and maybe he's not Robert Paul. That is up for you to determine, but he has a mouth, and he's telling all the papers about this story. He's telling different stories. Well, you need now to control that, because you know eventually they will find you. So what is the best course of action? Get in front of it. Get out before Robert Paul is dragged to the inquest, and you give your version of events, because that will be more believed. But then, to confuse the issue, well, you probably need to do another crime, and another crime quickly. Just remember that as we go through this trial. But the inquest is important, because he does not give his actual name. Instead of saying, I'm Charles Lechmere from 22 Dovedon Street, he says, I'm Charles Cross, which was another deception by Jack the Ripper. Well, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I see the prosecution has raised this name as being an issue. But why? Now, if you were coming up with a false name, maybe you might use Smith, Brown, Jones, one of those very, very common names. Why would you use a name that you are actually associated with? Yes, Charles Lechmere, his stepfather, was Cross. At one particular census, his name was listed as Cross. Now, we're not going into who put that name down, whether it was his stepfather, himself, or whatever. But there is a concern. We go through the Pickford's records, and there is no Charles Cross registered as ever having worked there. So that's a bit strange. Except there's no Charles Lechmere either. Now, I would suggest back in those days, the employment records weren't as crucial as they are today. And so what you would end up doing is turning up, and they would know the look of your face. So when they were handing over the money, yes, back in the day, before you never saw cash, it all just goes into your bank account. Now you go and just tap and do whatever else to get rid of your money. Back then, they would actually hand you some stuff, which meant something. Now, they would only hand it to somebody that they knew, and that they knew by looking at them. So the name itself would be fairly immaterial. So the question then is, what are the prosecution saying who he was trying to hide from? Who was he trying to deceive by giving the name Cross at the inquest? Or was it his employer? Was it Pickford's? Well, if it was them, there's something wrong here, because there was an event almost 20 years previous where a Pickford's carman ran over and killed a young child. That carman at court was called Charles Cross. Now, the age of that carman, because he was quite young at the time, and the description of that carman matches Charles Lechmere. So now, this would have been big news for Pickford's. An employee of yours is going on trial effectively for murder. Yes, because it was suggested that he intentionally ran over this child. And naturally, this made the papers. So if your employee doesn't turn up for work after a massive accident that you would have known of, and he's at court using a name that you had no idea about, well, that would raise alarm bells. But now at that trial, he was found not guilty. But now there were 3 Charles Crosses in the area at the time, in London. Only one of them matches the description of Charles Lechmere. So my point is, I don't think he would have been using that name to hide from his employer. But now the question is, and it's suggested that, well, he wanted to hide this from his wife. Now, his wife was illiterate, and it's a sad indictment on society, but we know that women, even back, it's not that long ago when we think about it. We're only talking 120 odd years, and women were not given education. Their sole role in life was to look after the house and do domestic work. So why educate them? Because they're not going to get any other job. Totally wrong, by the way. Absolutely terrible. But being illiterate doesn't necessarily mean that you are stupid. In fact, I would say definitely doesn't mean that you are stupid. Because the thing is, I'm sure the neighbours and stuff would read the papers. And he gave his correct address at the inquest, 22 Doveton Street. So could you imagine, like, a bloke reading the paper tells his wife, hey, guess what? At that inquest for that murder the other day in Bucks Row, apparently some bloke lives next door. His name isn't Charles Lechmere, it's Charles Cross. So what's Mrs. Lechmere doing? She got another bloke on the side. So then the neighbour goes over and knocks on the door and says, hey, what's going on? Who's this Charles Cross bloke? So I don't think that would have sufficed to hide this from his wife. In fact, I would say that name at the inquest almost proves his innocence, because he was using the name that he was known at Pickford's, and if he was trying to hide it from his wife, well, he wasn't doing a very good job. So rather than showing deceit, it really shows that he was being honest. Well, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I see my esteemed colleagues from the defence have raised a lot of smoke and mirrors. They're trying to make it look like this bloke just could not have had anything to do with this crime. Every reasonable point, well, they're throwing up so many different counter-arguments just to cloud the issue. But there's one thing that they cannot hide, and that is the physical blood evidence, which points clearly to Charles Lechmere as having committed this crime in Bucks Row. And remembering, we're only starting with this one so far. There's a lot more evidence to show that he did the other crimes, and possibly even more. Because let's face it, Charles Lechmere is not the only first finder in this saga. Yes, that first person on the scene who finds a body, the police will always tend to look at in this day and age very closely. And we have other first finders in this saga. We have Louis Deemschutz in Burner Street. We got Indian Harry, Thomas Bowyer, at Miller's Court, peeking through the window at Mary Kelly. But none of them, even though cases have been made for both of them perhaps as being Jack the Ripper, none of them have the evidence against them as does Charles Lechmere. And that is the blood evidence. Now, it's P.C. Neal who discovers the body after Charles Lechmere and Robert Paul had already come across Polly Nichols. Now, P.C. Neal, he's signalling for other officers, yet he doesn't blow his whistle. But it's not PC Misen who is first on the scene with him. It's actually another police constable, Thane. But then not long after, they're joined by PC Misen. That timing of events will be critical as we go further through this. But it's PC Neil who now coordinates the investigation. So he sends for the doctor, and this doctor turns up. He's not too far away, and he comes on down and does that initial investigation of the body. Now, this doctor noted that blood was still flowing a little bit. Now, remembering it was Lechmere who was at the body in Bucks Row. Robert Paul comes on the scene. They are not there very long, and then they end up running into PC Misen in Hanbury Street. Now, because the doctor said that there was blood still flowing, he said the person must have been murdered minutes before the body being discovered. So Lechmere is there for an indeterminate amount of time. We don't know how long. It could have been a window of half hour, but at some point, Robert Paul comes up. They're around the body for a short amount of time before they disappear, and it would have almost seemed as if PC Neil came into Bucks Row as these people had moved out of sight. And then before too long, the doctor's called, so forth, and he then gives that time minutes after the body being discovered. This poor woman had been killed. And remembering it's Lechmere that says he's late for work, Robert Paul's late for work, but it's Lechmere who runs up to the police officer to get his story out first, as we have discussed. But he wanted far away from that scene, knowing full well that if challenged, he had the evidence on him that he perpetrated this crime. And the timing perfectly fits. Well, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what can I say? We've solved the case then. Charles Lechmere is Jack the Ripper. Absolutely, we may as well confine him to history as this worst ever serial killer, except there are some issues with the evidence that was just presented. Firstly, the doctor on the scene. Who did he believe found the body? Now, remembering it was PC Neil who was coordinating the effort, getting the doctor, getting the other police officers on the scene. Now, PC Misen, when did he mention these other two people in Hanbury Street? It didn't seem like it was much of a story until after Robert Paul gave interviews to the newspapers, and the newspapers printed the story. So at this point in time, I think it's safe to say that it's PC Neil who the doctor thinks found the body. So could it be PC Neil who did the crime? Because that timing would fit perfectly. And it's interesting, as the prosecution mentioned, that PC Neil did not blow his whistle. He had a whistle that was raised to him at the inquest. And they said, so did you blow your whistle to get attention? He said, well, no, I didn't. And there was no explanation given as to why he did not do so. So could you then imagine, though, the embarrassment that the police had to face when all these statements from Robert Paul are coming out in the papers about it wasn't the police who found the body, but rather it was these other two. And now that's important, because crime scene forensics certainly weren't what they are now back in those days. So this doctor, imagine the scene. He's bleary-eyed. They've woken him up. He's gone into Bucks Row, and he's probably looked down, seen what he saw, terrible, terrible event, and then had to make a quick judgment about what he thought happened, with so many differing factors that could have been at play here. For one, everybody's composition is a bit different. He didn't really know how the person had been killed. So that there's a lot of things that he just was totally unaware of, but had to make a quick judgment call. Now, why I'm making this point, and it's going to seem very contradictory, because I actually want what the prosecution says to be true. I want what this doctor said to be true, because that would prove my client, Charles Lechmere, innocent. And you think, but how? How on earth would that be the case? But now, at this simulation had to have occurred. The injuries are consistent, and even the blood flow is consistent with the heart having been stopped. Now, this is not the movies. Let's make that very, very clear. See, in the movies, you see someone go up and they almost just do that one little pinch or something like that, and the person's out or even dead. That is not how it works in real life, and you on the jury no doubt are familiar with true crime to understand that it takes considerable effort to kill someone in that way, which is absolutely terrible, but obviously Jack the Ripper had to have done this. The point is, we look at the timing, and the timing is very important here. Because whoever did this had a window of opportunity of about 30 minutes from when PC Neil would have gone past Bucks Row, into Bucks Row, out, completed his beat and come back around. Which would have meant that whoever perpetrated this crime met Polly Nichols elsewhere, comes back to Bucks Row into a nice secluded area, performs this murder, is able to start chopping the person up, then gets interrupted by Robert Paul, not long before PC Neil is coming back into Bucks Row. Now, everything would have had to have gone perfect for someone to have committed that crime. Or I should say for Charles Lechmere to have committed that crime. Because, you just think about it, Robert Paul would not have been the only person heading off to work. This was the time people were getting up. Remember, that's what PC Misen was doing. He was knocking on doors, getting people off to work. Not only that, it was the victims who led themselves to whatever secluded spot they could find. So he would have had less control over the timings and the location even. And would he have known that PC Neil was on that beat? But then in the process of finishing off this crime, he does get disturbed by this other gentleman, Robert Paul, coming into Bucks Row. Now, if the doctor was right, then it means Charles Lechmere had only just finished the crime, the murder itself, and only had just started the mutilation afterwards. That is what raises doubts about this entire scene, and it proves the innocence of Charles Lechmere. Because Robert Paul went past. Lechmere reaches out his hand and touches him. No blood is found on Robert Paul. That would have been an absolute telltale sign of the guilt of this person. But you know, it's interesting what people don't say, which is sometimes more important than what they actually do say. Now, Robert Paul never says that Lechmere appeared out of breath, because if Charles Lechmere had committed that crime, then he's standing in Bucks Row huffing and puffing, and Robert Paul does not make any statement along those lines in any way. Therefore, it is clear that he could not, Charles Lechmere could not have committed this crime. Well, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, again, a lot of words there by the defense, but not a lot of substance. Missing some obvious things that people could do. Charles Lechmere, this was not his first dance. There's no doubt about that. Most serial killers work their way up to start perpetrating these types of crimes, and the evidence is there that that happened in this case. And also, you see people, say the Winter Olympics, and they have the biathlon. They're skiing, then they got to get down and shoot. And what do? They slow their heart rate down very quickly so that they're able to perform that task. So who is to say that Charles Lechmere didn't do exactly the same thing? Yes, it took effort, but he had the time to basically control himself, make himself appear normal again. And it's interesting, isn't it, that Robert Paul comes into Bucks Row. What does Charles Lechmere not do? He doesn't come out straight away and say, mate, come over here, look what I've found. He waits for Robert Paul to go around him, to get past him. Now that is really odd. Put yourself in that scene for a moment. You've just come across this horrifying scene. Why are you hiding in the shadows? Would you not call over the first person? A single person coming down the street? This was no gang of people that you're going to be afraid of. So who would Lechmere have been afraid to see in that moment? A police officer, perhaps. It was close to the time when PC Neal would have been coming back into Bucks Row. So I am telling you now, he was making sure it was not one of the police officers doing their rounds. But then the question, and this is important, they asked, well, why then, when he realised it was just a civilian, why did he not then turn around and attack that person? Well, quite simply because of what the defence just said. The effort it takes to take someone out in that way, well, you need that strength back. You've already expended a lot of energy. And also, and these people are very cold, they're very calculating. They go after people they know they can subdue. Now, Robert Paul to Charles Lechmere was an unknown quantity, so there's no way he was going to attack him in that moment. Because what if Robert Paul fought back? And he likely would have. Well then, Charles Lechmere would have been caught. But then what Charles Lechmere does next further solidifies his guilt. Now he says, I'm running late for work. I've got to go. But instead of taking the most direct way to Pickford's, he walks up Bucks Row into Hanbury Street with Robert Paul. But if he was so concerned about his job, why did he do that? Well, as we saw, and we've mentioned, he had to control the narrative. He had to control the story. And he also needed to know who this Robert Paul bloke was. Get to know more about him. Well, could you imagine Charles Lechmere's shock as well? Not just the police seeing the story of Robert Paul, but Lechmere now seeing Robert Paul just gave away everything that happened in Bucks Row. He knows that they will start looking for that other person. So Charles Lechmere has to go to the inquest first. He doesn't know if Robert Paul's going to turn up. Fortunately for him, he doesn't. So he is able to tell his side of the story first, but then he needs to muddy the waters just in case his story is looked at in more detail. So something else has to happen. And he needs to cast some dispersions against the other bloke he was with in Bucks Row. So Robert Paul is probably going to be in for the shock of his life. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, before we dive in to what happened there in Hanbury Street, we do have to acknowledge before the defense starts making objections saying this is all circumstantial, we do acknowledge the fact that there is no longer any direct evidence against Charles Lechmere for being Jack the Ripper. And because the rest is a circumstantial case, they'll turn around and say, well, that's nonsense. Circumstantial, you just got to throw it out. But that is not true. Circumstantial evidence does not mean weak evidence. To illustrate circumstantial evidence, if you walked outside right now and you saw that the ground was wet, there were puddles in the road and people were holding umbrellas up, what would you naturally conclude? That it had rained. But you didn't see it rain. Therefore, for any Jack the Ripper suspect, every case is circumstantial. We don't have a confession, though that is debatable as regards James Maybrick. But generally accepted fact is there is no confession. There is no recordings of anyone. There was no cameras around recording what was seen. But we do have eyewitnesses. And people will say, well, that's the direct evidence that we need. Well, let me just say about that. Direct evidence is now being highly questioned in the courts. In fact, I draw your attention to a list of 10 names right now that you will see up on the screen. And that list of names are people who were convicted as a result of direct evidence where eyewitnesses were wrong. It is rather frightening. And if you took all the eyewitnesses who saw someone who they believe was Jack the Ripper, put them all together and tried to do a composite sketch, one of those ones that the police artists do, well, it was going to end up looking like Mr. Potato Head, because we would not have a clear description of anybody, because all the eyewitnesses gave such a varying degree of what they saw. And in this day and age, in our modern times, I would say that direct evidence is getting less and less reliable with the rise of AI. You could make anyone look like they're doing anything. So even now, video evidence really is going to be questioned shortly. So every case would be circumstantial. But there's two ways of looking at circumstantial evidence, and this is critical. And I ask you members of the jury to keep this in mind, because this is a very divisive subject, whether Charles Lechmere is Jack the Ripper or not. And so half of the people think he definitely isn't. So they think the circumstantial evidence is like a chain. And if you break one link in the chain, well, it's gone. So that people will say now that, well, not every bit of evidence matches up, therefore the whole case falls over. Well, we'll look at an example of that very shortly and show why that should not be the case. Now just consider how you should look at it. It's more like a steel corded rope. Now, if one little strand of that rope, that steel rope, breaks, the rest of it holds together. And you'd think, but no, that can't be right. Well, just think of one classic example, O.J. Simpson trial. Now, for those of you who were around when that happened, you probably remember one particular phrase the defense used. If it doesn't fit, you must acquit. Now, for you younger members of the jury, you may not know, but the prosecution made a terrible mistake. And yes, us prosecutors can make mistakes. They insisted that O.J. Simpson put on the glove that was found at the scene. And it didn't fit. That was a huge risk. But that was just one link in the chain. The majority of people, I believe, thought that he did it. The overwhelming circumstantial evidence would have suggested that he did it. But because of one piece of evidence, well, he was found not guilty. We don't want that to happen in this particular trial. Consider the collective evidence, not just one individual piece. So let's now dive into Hanbury Street And we're going to consider where Robert Paul fits into all of this. Now, there is a critical piece of evidence which people say breaks this chain if we're thinking of it as circumstantial. Elizabeth Long overheard a conversation between what she believed definitely was Annie Chapman and Jack the Ripper. And she says, according to all evidence, that was at 5:30 a.m. in Hanbury Street. Now, Albert Kadosh lived in 27 Hanbury Street, and he says around that time himself, he heard a noise over the back fence in 29 Hanbury Street, sounding like someone saying no and then hitting the fence and falling to the ground. Now, why Albert Kadosh was not alarmed, we will look at that shortly. But then, John Davis, who lived in 29 Hanbury Street, he's up, he goes out the back door and then finds the body of Annie Chapman at around 6 a.m. in the morning. Now, by that stage in the morning, there was enough light to see the whole scenario, and the wounds to Annie Chapman were similar and also worse than what happened to Polly Nichols in Bucks Row. And because of the similarity in this attack, it was soon linked that the same perpetrator had done both crimes. But now straight away people say, well, therefore it could not have been Charles Lechmere because he needed to be at work. He could not have been in Hanbury Street at 5:30 a.m. because he was a carman. And Carmen started before the sun went up. But there's two possibilities here. Charles Lechmere did not have to be at work that early, either that day or any day. Why Carmen used to get to work so early was to get the horses ready. Now, I've never had to get a horse ready, but I imagine it's a bit harder than just jumping in your car and turning a key or pushing a button these days. I would suggest that it would take at least an hour maybe to get the horses hitched up and settled down and ready for the day. Probably had to clean out some stables too, I would say. But it's also likely someone with Charles Lechmere's seniority within Pigford's, because he'd been working there many, many years, maybe someone else was doing that for him at that point. But also, and here's the thing, John Davis, who found the body, also was a carman. And he was just sort of getting up. He wasn't running off to work. Now, maybe he had a day off. Perhaps Charles Lechmere had the day off. We don't have the records of when these people worked. But the location of this attack is absolutely critical. And just imagine if you are Robert Paul. And yes, I started this before, and we're getting back to it. Now, Robert Paul did not appear at the inquest. He sort of went to ground a little bit. The police were trying to find him. Charles Cross, or Charles Lechmere, remember, he lied at the inquest about his name, but he was at the inquest, and he gave an interesting version of events. But now, only about 4 or 5 days after that initial inquest, and it wasn't closed at this point, Annie Chapman is found in Hanbury Street, that same street that Charles Cross and Robert Paul spoke to P.C. Misen. So subsequently, the police all of a sudden have big reason to find this bloke. Because perhaps, rather than him being an eyewitness, maybe he could be the perpetrator. Now, I'm not saying the police would have necessarily thought he was high on the suspect list, but they would have to rule him out. And particularly considering the evidence that he said to the papers. It differed greatly from what was said at the inquest. And that is the strong circumstantial evidence that Charles Lechmere was sending a message to Robert Paul to make sure his story supported what Charles Cross had said earlier at the inquest. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, in the newspapers, remembering he gave these reports straight away after the events. Firstly, he said he saw the man with the woman. Now, he's walking down Bucks Row, and unlike Charles Lechmere, who said he thought it was a tarpaulin, a tarp lying on the ground, Robert Paul said to the papers that he saw that it was a woman on the ground and a man standing near the body. He then says he grabbed her wrist in one newspaper and the hand felt dead cold. In fact, in another newspaper, he said it was assumed she must have been dead for some time, and he even suggested that maybe the body had been transported to the location, and he said that because there was no evident obvious signs of blood. Though he also said it was very, very dark, and he really couldn't see if there was any major bit of blood pooling on the ground. So then contrast that with now, remembering the time frame he went to the inquest 2 weeks after the event, a week after Annie Chapman is found in Hanbury Street. His story completely changed. Now, the man he saw, Charles Lechmere, is standing in the middle of the road. Then he's saying that, well, the body still felt a bit warm. In fact, he thought there was signs of life. Whilst he still does not mention any pooling of blood on the ground, he does suggest that he was sure that there was breath. Now consider this. Which version of events makes Charles Lechmere look guilty? The one where he's innocently standing in the middle of the road, like he's just come across something, said, "Oh, come over here." And then the body is still warm. So it would suggest that Lechmere had no time to perform that crime. He would have been right in the middle of doing it. And so it's unlikely that suspicion would have raised on either of them given that version of events. But the first version that he gave straight after the event, Lechmere was standing beside the body. The body was cold. Lechmere could have been in there for any indeterminate amount of time performing that crime before Robert Paul entered Bucks Row. So why did that story change so diversely? Other than Robert Paul maybe got a message sent that his story had to change, had to support what Charles Cross said at the initial inquest. Well, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, as a defence team, I will acknowledge that we will use the term circumstantial evidence and try to make it look like that's not very good evidence. But that's our job. We want to raise that doubt in your mind, absolutely. But the prosecution didn't bring up any evidence. They brought up a circumstantial story, and that is a totally different thing. And just consider for a moment the actual events of what would have happened if what they're saying is true. Charles Lechmere is in Bucks Row doing that atrocity to Polly Nichols. Almost gets caught in the act as Robert Paul comes into Bucks Row. He then has to make a quick decision about exactly how he's going to handle that. And then he walks up with Robert Paul up Hanbury Street, sees the policeman, he runs up to him, sends him back, but then he decides to send a message to this bloke, Robert Paul. So he goes a week later, while the inquest for the crime in Bucks Row is still going on, and we're talking, this was only a short walk away. He goes back to Hanbury Street, where that policeman very well could be back on the beat. He finds Annie Chapman, goes into the back of 29 Hanbury Street as the daylight is starting to appear. And 29 Hanbury Street was a known haunt for unfortunates. It appears that the landlady of 29 Hanbury Street turned a blind eye to some shenanigans going on in that backyard. Maybe there was a kickback. Who knows? But then He performs that crime, but that house had 20 to 30 people living in it. The sun was coming up. Daylight was starting to break. Now just consider if John Davis had have come out whilst Charles Lechmere was still at the back of 29 Hanbury Street. What if Albert Kadosh had have poked his head over the back of the fence and then gave a bit of an eyewitness account of who he saw? What would Charles Lechmere then say if he found another body murdered in very similar circumstances in a very short geographic distance apart? What's he going to say now? Well, I was on my way to work and I then ducked in behind, went through a hallway of 29 Hanbury Street because I thought I saw something which you couldn't see from the road. Now, he would have been absolutely convicted right there for those two crimes. Would you take that risk? I would say it's absolutely absurd. Rather than being circumstantial evidence, I would suggest it's just a plain ludicrous story. And therefore, Your Honour, I move that this case gets dismissed against Charles Lechmere, because they have not raised even a skerrick of motive for doing this crime. I object, Your Honour, and I say before you even consider a dismissal, which obviously isn't going to happen, let's look at the motive then, since they've raised it. But there are three possible motives. Firstly, that these crimes were driven by some type of sexual psychopath. And what we mean is, these crimes were not motivated by robbery. They were also not motivated by rage, as can be seen in the meticulous way the person went about cutting up the bodies. Now, it's not to say that they were necessarily skilled as a surgeon or anything, but it was not a frenzied attack. So the motive there could very well be this desire to do these mutilations for those reasons, as we've said. It could have also been for psychopathic thrill. Some of these people enjoy the adrenaline from doing these horrendous crimes. And even the fact that he stood there in Bucks Row when Robert Paul was coming up, he didn't run away. That is the type of person who would definitely enjoy the feeling that they would get from messing with people and also the police. And there are other crimes. If convicted of these, we will be pursuing charges showing that he definitely was doing that. But now, before the defense jumps up and makes a big thing of this, I will state, no, we cannot know for sure the motive of this person, because we are relying solely on a couple of newspaper articles and some short statements at an inquest. That's accepted. It's not like today where we can see video evidence of people being interviewed and you get to see their reactions. So we can't gauge that. But what we do know is that he fitted at least one of these particular descriptions, and therefore he had motive and opportunity to perform these crimes. Well, again, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the prosecution are just throwing mud at a wall, hoping that you think some of it will stick, but let's face it, it's a Teflon wall they're throwing because it's just sliding right off. As regards the sexual motive that they raised, there is no evidence at all in Charles Lechmere's life that he was inclined that way in any shape or form. There's no record that he ever contracted the syphilis, the venereal disease that was rampant in the area at the time. There's no evidence to say that he ever visited unfortunates or ever had a problem with them. He had 11 children or 12 children throughout his life. He lived up until he was 70, and his wife lived another 20 years after, and she did not have any known diseases like that. So it's unlikely Well, it's actually, I'd say, impossible that that was his motive, as they would state. But rather than this psychopathic thrill, like standing in Bucks Row, we won't argue whether he was near the body or in the middle of the road. But standing there is exactly what an innocent person would do. You come across a horrific scene, you can't take your eyes off it. You're standing there, probably like a stunned mullet. Someone comes along and then you just want to get their attention to help you out, which is what he did. There was no thrill involved in that scenario. And I'd also say in his history, there was no record of any violence. Now, the prosecution might throw up, if they can pin it, even though they don't want to, because he was known as Charles Cross at the time, that incident with on the cart for Pickfords and that poor young lad getting run over. But outside of that, which was deemed by the courts an absolute accident, so he was not convicted of anything there, there is no other record of any common assaults or anything to show that he had these violent tendencies. And as regards opportunity, we've discussed that before. I'm not bringing it up, but we've got thousands of people that could have had the opportunity to do these crimes. The prosecution is first assuming that Charles Lechmere is the killer, and then they are inventing motives to fit that narrative. This is circular reasoning, and I believe, Your Honour, it should be thrown out. Your Honour, as the prosecution, we want to ask you this question. Before you consider this case for dismissal, we know that serial killers don't come with labels. Just consider some of the most infamous serial killers. BTK was a church leader. Shipman was a doctor. Jeffrey Dahmer held down a stable job just as Charles Lechmere did. So just because the outward appearance that we have is one that wouldn't necessarily match the description for the motives we've given does not mean the person wasn't Jack the Ripper. And to the jury, I say, look at the crime scenes themselves. The escalation of the crimes fits that profile. And again, the first person on the scene was Charles Lechmere. And then we are seeing the pattern of where and why he was performing all these others. And we've still got 3 more to discuss, which really put all these pieces of the puzzle together. It makes a very strong circumstantial case. It's Charles Lechmere's own actions that are telling this story. Well, Your Honour, I am putting this to you. I still call for a dismissal, because we are here to judge evidence, not their assumptions. Was there any thought of him being Jack the Ripper back in the day? No, there was no contemporary accusation against him at all. They had hundreds of people that they were looking at. Why did he not raise an alarm back then? Motives must stand on their own feet. See, they've gone to the conclusion that he's Jack the Ripper, then built the motive around that. But that's not how this works. Lechmere had no proven motive. He had no recorded anger towards women, and he had no recorded psychological breakdown, like so many other Jack the Ripper suspects had. Speculation is not proof, and as regards motive, the case against Charles Lechmere collapses. So, Your Honour, again, I say you dismiss these charges against an innocent man. But the judge has decided that the defence's call for a dismissal is overruled. The case is going to continue. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we move to the night of the 29th of September, early hours of the 30th of September, 1888. And we have to acknowledge here that 2 women were brutally murdered in the Whitechapel area. That being Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes. Elizabeth Stride in Dutfield's Yard, which was off Burner Street, her body found in the International Working Men's Club. And Catherine Eddowes was found in Mitre Square. Some 20 to 30 minutes walk, maybe shorter if you knew a few shortcuts. And this is where the prosecution, we are asserting that these crimes fit perfectly with the person on trial being Charles Lechmere. But there is a point of contention here which we will acknowledge. For the Elizabeth Stride murder to have happened, which was not long after midnight, well, we would assume then that Charles Lechmere either left really early for work or, being a Saturday night, this was possibly his day off. Now, you would say, how do you explain to your wife and kids that, look, I'm working 6 days a week pretty hard. On my night off, I'm going to start patrolling the streets. Well, it is important to state here that Charles Lechmere's mother lived in the direction of Mitre Square. And one of his daughters was living with his mother. So it'd be quite an easy explanation to the wife. Say, look, I'm just going off to visit Mum and our daughter. But you need to stay here looking after all the kids. Perfect alibi. She wouldn't ask any questions. Now, Elizabeth Stride is an interesting case because we have at least 3 different eyewitnesses saying they saw a man with her not long before she was murdered. One being a policeman, another being Israel Swartz inside Berner Street itself. Oddly, none of these descriptions match up. If they did, as we've said before, a composite sketch, you would not find Charles Lechmere. So we can't really rely on the eyewitnesses, but that suited Charles Lechmere perfectly. He could blend in. And then, taking advantage of the situation there with Elizabeth Stride, he takes her into Dutfield's yard and begins his brutal attack. But then, as he is in the middle of doing that, he hears the clip-clop and the rackety wheels of a cart coming up the road. This is a sound that he knows very, very well, being a carman. And he also would know, with the Dutfield's yard layout, that it's likely that that cart could very well be coming in to Dutfield's yard. And so what does he do? He ceases the attack. His crime is interrupted. He could very easily just hide in those shadows, remembering he has shown this propensity for that. In Bucks Row, standing over the body of Polly Nichols, he didn't panic. So he was able to wait until the opportunity came and casually walk out without drawing attention to himself and taking off in the direction of where his mother lived. And he was now way more cautious after making one catastrophic mistake in Bucks Row. That we are going to talk about, and you probably, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, don't exactly know what that mistake is, but it is staring us directly in the face, which also points and pins Charles Lechmere as Jack the Ripper. But he is not going to hang around this time, and he can slip away, which he does. But now, the big question here, and many people would say that just makes no sense. Why, in the pursuit of a crime, you get interrupted? Why on earth would you be motivated to then continue on and look for another victim that very night? If things had gone so wrong, surely you would just duck home. Or maybe just go straight to the mother's house just to cover your alibi, because now this event in Dutfield's yard is going to get well known. So you need to make sure now that you actually do get to where you said you were going to go. Well, you see, this is of interest. We have so much more information about the mind of a serial killer today. And remembering, we are looking at this from the point of view of how it is perceived now. And we could look at so many different serial killers who were exactly in this situation. Ted Bundy, for example. He got interrupted on a couple of occasions and then went off and found another victim that very night. The Green River Killer. He also, a couple of times, was not unable, for whatever reason, to perform his murders. And so then he would seek another victim that same night. BTK, Dennis Rader, did exactly the same thing, as well as the Yorkshire Ripper. So we see the pattern with these serial killers. Interruption leads to escalation. So what do we see here? Well, not long after the attack on Elizabeth Stride, Charles Lechmere comes across Catherine Eddowes, who had only just been let out of prison, deemed sober enough to leave, simply because they didn't want to hold people in the cells any longer than they needed to. And she walks out, probably straight into the arms of her assailant. Now again, eyewitnesses saw someone with Catherine Eddowes, which does not match the description of Charles Lechmere. That we know of. But again, we had 3 people standing, looking, and they all gave different descriptions for whatever reason. But this did lead to an escalation in the attack. Up to this point, before we get to Miller's Court and Mary Kelly, this was the most brutal attack by Jack the Ripper. And that simply fits the pattern of what we know today about the minds of a serial killer. Well, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, again, I feel the need to say, as the defense team, we find this just pure speculation. It's a good story, but not based in fact. And there's even debate amongst many people today who would say that Elizabeth Stride was not a Jack the Ripper victim in the first place. This did more appear like a domestic violence attack. She had defensive wounds. There was one single injury done to her. Did Louis Deemschutz interrupt the killer? Well, that is, we don't know. And so if Elizabeth Stride was murdered by someone else, then we can eliminate Charles Lechmere as being the perpetrator. But I know some of you there would say, no, this definitely fits how it all went down. So we need to look at a bit further. Now, the prosecution has raised the eyewitnesses and how none of them really saw anyone matching Charles Lechmere's description. And that is significant. And we'll say why. Because even with so many Jack the Ripper suspects, famous Jack the Ripper suspects, like for example, Jacob Levy, we have no known description of the bloke at all. Because he was just a regular person who didn't stand out back in the day. But with Charles Lechmere, we have photos. So he obviously was well-to-do enough to be able to afford getting family portraits. And yet none of the descriptions of all the different eyewitnesses would we find someone that matches that. So you would think after all this time, somehow we would have one witness that places Charles Lechmere anywhere near all of these other scenes. So ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I ask you to look at the facts rather than the theories. Again, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, here at the prosecution, we are looking at the facts. It is the defense that are just throwing up needless stories to try and cloud the issue. Let's look at the facts of the double event. Fact 1. Elizabeth Stride was murdered sometime around 12:30, we can assume. And then, within an hour, bit less, Catherine Eddowes is found in Mitre Square. That walking distance fits the pattern perfectly. Fact number 2, the Eddowes crime shows the escalation as we've already stated. And fact 3, it would have required intimate knowledge of the streets for someone to get out of Mitre Square undetected with all the police, all the vigilance committees, he must have had somewhere to go. And that person with that intimate knowledge and also had a place where he could hide was Charles Lechmere. Well, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, again, let's look at the real facts of this case. For Charles Lechmere to have performed these crimes totally unseen, no eyewitness giving a description that remotely looks like him, well, it would have required a tremendous amount of luck. The building, the International Working Men's Club that was attached to Dutfield's yard, was packed with people. Where Elizabeth Stride was found, people were coming and going. It was a regular entrance for the members. So that just is incredibly risky for this person to do that crime. Which also doubles down when it comes to Mitre Square. So if he's done this crime in Dutfield's yard and then takes off and finds Catherine Eddowes, he has no idea when that policeman was last in the Mitre Square. He would have no idea how long he had to perform what he was doing. And the chance of getting caught was highly, highly likely. Because with the commotion that happened down in Burner Street, well, the police would have been absolutely on the alert. They were stopping every bloke on foot. But the prosecution would say that's not a problem because, one, he knew the street, but he had somewhere to go, his mother's house. So I just asked this question. Just think of this. You've just committed the most brutal crime up to this point. You have possible excrement and blood all over you, and you rock up to your mum's house. I mean, were they asleep? Did he just try to sneak in and wash up? Or did he just knock on the door and say, oh, you don't mind, I've just been up to a bit of murder? You won't tell anyone, will you? Do you mind if I just clean up a bit here? Oh, by the way, can you store these body parts somewhere for me? Knowing that the police very well could have been raiding the houses. He basically would have now blocked himself in somewhere where he just couldn't get away. So I would suggest that even the prosecution would say that this is stretching the realm of believability a little bit. Well, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, now we actually get to something which is very compelling that makes Charles Lechmere the guilty person in this. And that was where the apron was found. Yes, Catherine Eddowes' apron was found underneath basically an archway with some graffiti above it. Now, we are going to look at that. Now, firstly, was the graffiti written by Jack the Ripper? That is debatable, and we don't know the exact wording. It wasn't saved. But what is known, what has been recorded, was that the writing had a very neat appearance about it. So this wasn't just a scrawl put up by someone fairly illiterate. And we know Charles Lechmere had a reasonable education. In all legal documents, he actually signed his own name in a fairly neat way. And that was fairly unique for someone of his background, basically. Being a working East Ender, many didn't have that level of education. So he would have been able to write that graffiti if Jack the Ripper wrote it. But just assume again, because we can't say that definitively that he wrote that, but he could have, is the point we were making. He no doubt would have walked past that graffiti and seen it. And after spending some time hidden away, wherever that could have been, he may have had his own bolt hole somewhere else. But then he comes out and drops the apron near that graffiti, knowing it's going to be found and knowing that it will throw the police off who they should be looking for. We know that a policeman maintains he walked past that area. There was no apron. And then later, and it was a big chunk of the apron, it would not be missed. Then he sees it. This is the hallmark of the person we're talking about, a cold and calculating serial killer? Well, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, again, we think this strains belief. Would Charles Lechmere, if he was found on the street, if he had been caught with that apron, it would have been all over for him. Would he have risked going out and doing that? Knowing the police were searching homes. They got reprimanded for not searching enough homes. Because perhaps if they kicked a few more doors in, they would have caught the perpetrator. It defies believability that at this point, with the streets now flooded, because he's left a significant amount of time when Catherine Eddowes' body had been found. So now the police and everyone would have been swarming the streets. Would you risk going out to write a message and drop the apron? Highly, highly unlikely. However, I will give the prosecution this. I believe that if Charles Lechmere committed any of the Jack the Ripper crimes, it was these two. And I know, ladies and gentlemen, you're going to be thinking, what on earth? Why are you conceding that? Well, the simple point is, what serial killer in all history has ever performed a crime on his way to work? I can't find one. The prosecution before mentioned four serial killers. Not a single one of them performed the crime before work. It was always done afterwards. Why? Because these are not spree killers. Serial killers are controlled. They plan these things, and they also know things can go wrong. So you couldn't really take the risk of trying to do these things on your way to work. Because how many times could you turn up maybe with a black eye, maybe with some scratches, and people not start asking questions? Whereas on the way home or after work, well, if something goes wrong, it's not a big problem. And that's why if Charles Lechmere had this day off, then these are the only two crimes he realistically could have done. Which I'm going to say now, I don't think he simply did any of them. But we will say right now, obviously, the whole notion of Charles Lechmere being Jack the Ripper is blown away if they can't pin him for that first crime in Bucks Row, which, as I state now, quite simply, he was on his way to work, therefore he could not have done it. Now, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we are now moving on to the final crime in the canonical victims of Jack the Ripper. And you might have found this odd. As a prosecution, we said that there were no real sightings of Charles Lechmere after Bucks Row. And you think, well, would that not prove his innocence? No, because of the one mistake that he made very early on. So it was only about 3 days after Polly Nichols was found that he presents to the inquest. Why did Charles Lechmere go to the inquest into the person that he murdered? Considering his actions on that very night, he went up to PC Misen and basically gave him the slip by saying, "You're wanted back there because there's a policeman waiting." Why then did he present? Well, quite simply, this was his one mistake. And this is the only reason why we even know of Charles Lechmere in connection with the Jack the Ripper crimes. Yes, he probably thought that he could slip off into the night, as he did. But that was until he read the newspapers. And the bloke that interrupted him, who came up that street, Robert Paul, is now talking to the media. And he's mentioning there was someone else on the scene. So now it was imperative that he is not seen anywhere else. He wanted to continue his crime spree, but one sighting, just one simple one, would definitely put a target on his back. And so now he needed to be extra careful. Except we do have one further sighting of him. That was a man by the name of George Hutchinson, who says he knew Mary Kelly very well, and he saw what is believed to be the last person to see Mary Kelly alive walking down the street. Now, he gives a very detailed description, and we will admit that that description is so detailed that some of it we have to question, except there is one particular point that would have been easy to notice. And that is, he said the person with Mary Kelly had a carroty mustache. Now, that is important because Charles Lechmere at the inquest is described as having a fair mustache. Not a dark mustache, not a black mustache. But you might say that a carroty mustache is not a fair mustache, but it is in comparison to what people were comparing against. Dark mustaches, black mustaches. This was a lighter coloured one. And so it was described as fair. So therefore, it is likely that Charles Lechmere was seen with Mary Kelly by George Hutchinson. And it would explain the look that George Hutchinson received from the person who was walking with Mary Kelly. But why Mary Kelly? Because this one, many people say it just doesn't quite fit the Jack the Ripper crimes leading up to this. Well, as we have discussed here, there was an escalation by the perpetrator in these particular 5 victims, starting from Polly Nichols, going to Annie Chapman. Definitely Elizabeth Stride's murder was interrupted, and so then when Catherine Eddowes was attacked in Mitre Square, that was the most brutal up until this particular point, where the Mary Kelly crime scene is still considered one of the worst that you could possibly imagine. In fact, the body was attacked so badly, it was unrecognizable. But that would fit what Charles Lechmere had to do here. He could not risk getting caught. No doubt he had some close calls. In Dutfield's yard with Elizabeth Stride. Even in Bucks Row, that very first one. But to satisfy his need, this craving that he had, the only way to do so was find a location where he could be undisturbed. And that would be someone who had a room. So Charles Lechmere meets Mary Kelly, and they go in on that fateful night, and he can complete his work, undisturbed by someone such as Robert Paul in Bucks Row, undisturbed by someone like Louis Deemshoots coming back into Dutfield's yard, and undisturbed by P.C. Watkins in Mitre Square. And hence, that's why we see what we saw in Miller's Court. But you are going to assert then, why did the crime stop? Because that makes no sense. Why was he escalating up and then they just cease? Well, we would make an assertion here that they didn't really cease, but we will acknowledge that if we are looking at these 5 canonical victims, there is an explanation. Serial killers sometimes do just stop. BTK, Dennis Rader, he stopped his crimes. He started up again after many years and made one mistake, but he had not perpetrated a crime for about 16 years. The Golden State Killer, D'Angelo, well, he ceased his crimes. He only got caught because of DNA evidence. If we had genuine DNA evidence, then we would definitely be able to match Charles Lechmere to this particular crime being Mary Kelly, and therefore we could fit him in with all the others, no problem at all. Well, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have to say, if the prosecution are hanging their case on George Hutchinson's identification of the carroty mustache bloke walking with Mary Kelly down the Dorset Street, well, then we may as well not even bother responding. What were we doing wasting our time here in the first place? Because it just makes no sense at all. In fact, we don't even know if George Hutchinson was even in the street. I mean, he could have been inserting himself. Also, he only came back 3 days after the Mary Kelly crime made all the papers. They want us to believe that because he had the possibility of committing that crime, that he probably did. Well, let me tell you, there is a much more simpler explanation for the Mary Kelly crime scene than some innocent carman who just happened to walk somewhere near that area on his way to work. Let me tell you what more likely happens in Miller's Court. Now, John McCarthy was the slumlord, we might say, of Miller's Court. So many people lived in these dingy little rooms and he was collecting the rent. Now, Mary Kelly, it is said, was behind in the so-said rent. So he sends his hired help, a retired military person, Thomas Bowyer, better known as Indian Harry, to go get Mary Kelly's rent on that morning after she was murdered. Now, why? Why did McCarthy send Indian Harry to get the rent? Only for Mary Kelly, because that's significant. He wasn't doing the rounds. He wasn't knocking on every door saying, "Where's the money?" It was solely to collect arrears at 13 Miller's Court. Well, it's because John McCarthy had said he'd noticed that Mary Kelly had clients. Well, at least that's the assumption. He knew that she had met a few people, therefore probably had some money, so go get that money before she goes out and drinks it away. Now, a tenant of Miller's Court had seen John McCarthy out the front of his chandler's shop on that very evening. It is known that he watched that place like a hawk. Now, it is important to state that housing unfortunates, women who were selling themselves, was highly illegal. You just would not do that. You could go to prison for that, and John McCarthy was known to the police. In fact, Sergeant Thick at one stage, who was a well-known person as a policeman on the beat during the Jack the Ripper Saga, he actually at one point gave a character reference to John McCarthy when himself and a few associates were on trial for being involved in prize fighting. They weren't doing the fighting, by the way. No, they were just making the money on the side. So he sends Indian Harry to go and collect the rent. Indian Harry peers through the curtain of the broken window. So John McCarthy knew that window was broken. Indian Harry knew that window was broken. Indian Harry sees that scene and goes back to John McCarthy and informs him of what he just saw. Now, what would you do? We're talking, we'll go back to Bucks Row right now before we go further. What would you do if you were walking down Bucks Row and you saw what Charles Lechmere saw? Well, it's hard to know, but I would suggest maybe you would freeze, as it would appear that Charles Lechmere did until support came along. But now you're the landlord and you've just found one of your tenants murdered. What is your first course of action? Well, you'd go to the police. That's not what John McCarthy does initially. He does send Indian Harry off, but Indian Harry had a limp. He had a war injury. He couldn't move that fast. And for an indeterminate amount of time, John McCarthy stays back there in Miller's Court. But by the time he's done whatever he was doing, he has taken off, caught up with Indian Harry, and then they are coming up with a story that they are going to tell to the police, which changes on a couple of occasions. And not only that, when they get to the police station, the first words out of his mouth are, can I choose the inspector that's going to come back and investigate this? Now, naturally, John McCarthy says, I did not know that untoward activities were happening in my dwellings. I'm just totally innocent of that, even though there was at least another one, possibly two people who were active in that profession who were renting rooms there at Miller's Court. Now let's apply the logic that the prosecution uses for Charles Lechmere just because he happened to come across a body. Who looks more suspicious in this scenario? John McCarthy, no doubt, has a key to the room. When the police are around, and we've got some high-ranking police officials, they were waiting for some bloodhounds to come and try and track this Jack the Ripper. So they're waiting around outside for hours, and we've got some heavy hitters standing outside. John McCarthy knocks the door down. He bashes the door in, even though he would have had a key to open it. Why? Because he didn't want people to know he had access to the room. He also would have known he could have just done the latch on the lock, could have got in there. Why did he not do so? Why did he not have a description of anybody that came in there to Miller's Court? So all of that put together makes a case that John McCarthy was the one that went in to Miller's Court, 13 Miller's Court. He had a key. He would have known when Mary Kelly was alone. He brutally attacks her and then makes the body unrecognizable, burns what he can, stages a scene as well. The following morning, he sends Indian Harry to discover the body, but he already has a plan in place as to what he's going to do, and he gets away with murder. So, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, do you think that is a feasible story? It does fit. In fact, I believe not only could I make a strong case that John McCarthy murdered Mary Kelly, I could make a very strong argument that he was Jack the Ripper himself, because I believe there is way more circumstantial evidence to pin him for the crime, and probably more direct evidence than they have for Charles Lechmere. So now we are going on to the closing arguments. We've discussed all the evidence around the crime, so let's look at them, starting with the prosecution. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, again we have seen the tactic of the defence, be it anyone but the person on trial, Charles Lechmere. But to cut through all the noise, let's solely look at the facts. Was it just by a sheer coincidence that Charles Lechmere is at the body in Bucks Row when he gets interrupted by somebody and they take off, but when the police and medical people come along, they pinpoint the time when Polly Nichols was attacked? And it's that time exactly when Charles Lechmere was standing over the body. Was it just by mere chance that Robert Paul could not notice someone walking only maybe 20 paces in front of him, or not hear him walking in that distance up Bucks Row? The point being there is Lechmere was already there. He was not just walking up the road as he claimed, seeing a tarpaulin and go and look and find out it's a woman's body, and then Robert Paul comes. That just doesn't pass the pub test. Could also PC Misen have been wrong when Charles Lechmere says there's a policeman wanting you back there in Bucks Row, after Charles Lechmere and Robert Paul have gone up Hanbury Street, which also wasn't on his direct way to work? So Charles Lechmere's taken a detour here, even though he's late for work. And the first policeman they come across, he gives a deceptive answer to. So therefore, the policeman doesn't stop and question either of them or take their details. Is it just a chance that all the crimes seem to happen on Charles Lechmere's way to work, or in the case of the double event, in throwing distance to his mother's house when he had the night off and more time to perpetrate these crimes? Well, if it was so obvious, they're going to say, why on earth wasn't this bloke caught? With all the attention, all the people out on the street. Well, quite simply, the police and the general public too were looking in the wrong area. Well, they said the person had to be insane, had to have something mentally wrong with them. And not only that, they had to be a foreigner. Couldn't be one of the British people. And also had to be sexually insane, as the term was coined back then. No, it could not be a working man with a family who was British. No. That type of person could not have committed the crime. Yet today we know that that is the exact type of person that will perpetrate these crimes. Serial killers do blend in. So yes, he was a family man. Yes, he had a job. And yes, he had that second side to him. It's a side that he hid from everyone. And in fact, he hid it for over 100 years. But now, due to some very good investigative work and a determination to dig into the truth, we have finally unmasked Jack the Ripper. So, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the only verdict you can return is guilty. Well, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I think we've seen throughout this entire trial that the prosecution is raising up an argument saying it's most likely probable that Charles Lechmere was Jack the Ripper. But that's only because they're saying it's possible, and there's a massive difference between those two terms. You see, it is possible that the sun will explode and not rise in the morning. It could happen. But is it probable? See, the chances of the sun coming up are highly, highly likely. It's been doing so for millions of years. So let's look at the main arguments then that the prosecution raise up, and we'll show why they just don't stand up to any real challenge. Robert Paul in Bucks Row. See, he came under tremendous suspicion. The police did a huge investigation into him. Why? Because his story changed so much. So if we are relying on the testimony of him to determine what he saw in Bucks Row, when he got there, and what exactly happened in the interaction between him and Charles Lechmere, well then that is very, very shaky. And therefore we can understand why Charles Lechmere, who used the name Cross at the inquest, which we'll touch on in a second, would have presented himself to the inquest, because he would have thought, if this joker, who is running his mouth in the papers, keeps going, they're going to start thinking it's me, and I'm innocent. So I might just go and tell them the exact story of what really happened before this other clown just ruins it all. But then people say, well, what about the name? When he turns up to the inquest, well, he was being deceptive. Well, but was he? All of the victims, that's right, all of the victims used different names. In fact, Catherine Eddowes said that her last name was Kelly when she was let out of prison the night that she got murdered. It was a very common practice, so I don't know why they keep going on about that. And we could go through all of those points that the prosecution mentioned, but that would only dignify the arguments. The point is, you throw enough mud, some of it will stick. And the name of Charles Cross / Charles Allen Lechmere has now been tarnished, and we won't be able to clean all that mud off. But what we can do is set the record straight and find Charles Lechmere not guilty. So now the judge comes in to do the summing up and the direction to us, the jury. We have sat through quite an interesting trial. A couple of things need to be remembered as you are deliberating on this particular case. Firstly, in law, there is no difference between direct and circumstantial evidence. They have the same weight. You can be convicted on circumstantial, and you can actually get acquitted because of direct evidence as well. And as has been shown, Direct evidence in the Jack the Ripper crimes is dubious at best. And there are limitations to what we could look at. Firstly, we could not interview anybody directly involved in the case. We are also relying on a lot of reports, not from direct sources, but from newspapers, and the newspapers back in the day could have made mistakes. They could have also embellished certain stories too. So all of that needs to be kept in mind. And also the burden of proof rests with the prosecution. The defense does not have to prove a thing. All they have to do is raise the counter arguments. If the prosecution has not satisfied in your mind that Charles Lechmere is the guilty person, well, then you must find the person not guilty. But on the other hand, reasonable doubt does not mean no doubt. If I may take what the defense used, they said the sun might not come up tomorrow. You may have a small bit of doubt in your mind about that, but is that reasonable? We would say no. So even if you have some doubts, but they're not great doubt, then you must find the person guilty. So now, we are putting the charge over to you, the jury. What will you decide? Okay, so that is the trial. We are now in the jury phase, and I'm now part of the jury as well. I'm just one voice in this jury too, by the way. I don't claim that my opinions are any more weightier than any of you. And that's what I really do enjoy about the pub test since I've started it. There can be lots of comments, lots of differing views, and everybody keeps things respectful, and we can just have a reasonable conversation without the vitriol or I don't know, hatred beats me. But regardless, my point here is I'm going to discuss a couple of things before I give my opinion, partly to give you a chance to think, well, which way are you leaning after all of this evidence has been presented? And there was a couple of things I didn't bring up in the trial, and that was intentional. It wasn't, I just missed it. But there was those anatomical Venuses, and there was a museum or a shop or whatever it was that was showing these particular models, and it's of women, and they sort of cut open and all the different body parts are on the inside. Now, I've seen the photos, and that creeps me right out. And it's been suggested that Charles Lechmere passed that every day to work, and that triggered up in his mind wanting to do these crimes. And the Mary Kelly one was a replica of some of these anatomical Venuses. Now, the purpose of these models apparently was medical students. They could learn what the anatomy was and what the different body parts were and where they fitted in. So there was a purpose. They had a point to them. They weren't just there to freak people out like me. But I never mentioned them in the trial for a good reason, because I don't think it would have helped either side of the argument. And that is important, and it does happen in trials. And I'll use the example of O.J. Simpson trial, which became the first televised trial that kicked off the true crime court cases. If you do remember the story of O.J. Simpson and having accused of murdering 2 people in his mansion, it came to note by the news media because he led a low-speed chase with helicopters and the police trying to talk him down after they'd found these bodies, and he's looking like he's on the run. And people thought, well, the prosecution would bring that up because that makes him look really, really guilty. And the defense wouldn't want it mentioned at court. But that was never mentioned in the trial, and that trial went a very long time. And you'd think, why did the prosecution not use it? Perhaps if they did, they would have got a guilty verdict. But the reason why they didn't, and it is very intriguing, that the jury was predominantly African American, and they knew, the prosecution knew, the feeling of what an African American person would have looked at that situation. And that is that perhaps this poor African American guy who is famous is being targeted and victimized by the police. Because that did happen a lot in the United States. I think the Black Lives Matter movement actually showed that anybody of color in a predominantly white society, how they are viewed and how they feel, despite even the fact if they are very famous and have some influence, if people don't recognize them, how they were viewed even by the general public and the police, wasn't the same as everyone else. And so the prosecution knew that all the defense would have to say is, well, O.J. Simpson was on the run because he didn't want to be targeted in that way. He felt, having 2 white people dead in his mansion, he was going to get pinned for it. And so then the jury would have thought that makes sense. That probably could have happened. And so that was never mentioned at trial because it was not going to help either argument. So that's why I didn't bring up those anatomical Venuses, because it just doesn't support either argument. But now I've rambled on long enough. It is time for me to voice my opinion on this entire trial. And I'm in that jury room and we're polling, and I'm saying, I think he's not guilty. Now, before we get into a huge conversation on this, I'm not saying, like many people do, that the case is totally baseless or weak. I can see a strong argument for it. And in fact, in doing this process of trying to prove it, it did raise a few little points that I'd never considered before. And I thought, well, this actually has more merit than when I first started this channel. As I said, I'd been out of looking at the Jack the Ripper Saga for a little while, and all of a sudden this suspect was front and center, and I thought, why? But now I do understand why. But the things that just don't quite pass it for me, it just doesn't pass the pub test for me, are about 2 or 3 little items. Firstly, the crimes happened primarily when he was on his way to work. I just don't see how that would happen. It just... And tell me if I'm wrong here, but I've not known of anybody who does these types of things do so when they have to be somewhere else. They normally do it, it's after work, or when they do have time off. And I think I mentioned in this trial, that's why the double event could fit, because he's got the day off, but the others just don't match it for me. And the other thing is, with P.C. Misen in Hanbury Street on that night, when Charles Lechmere has gone up, at the inquest, it is brought up, he's challenged about saying, did you not say a policeman was back there? Now, he argues it. Now, why that is important is because surely then, the police don't like being told they're wrong. They would have looked at him very, very closely and investigated him, surely. Because they did with Robert Paul. They went through him like a dose of salts because his story was inconsistent. But it would seem that what he said to P.C. Misen, Charles Lechmere that is, probably passes the pub test for them, because maybe they did go to P.C. Misen and say, look, what did he actually say? And he could have said what he's just said. I mean, it's a bold move to go to the inquest in front of all the officials and basically lie in front of all of them and them not to come after you. So that is where I stand on it, but I am just one voice in this entire argument, as I've stated, and I think there might be an appeal on the way, but we'll see what happens there. But I am open to a further conversation about some of this evidence, and maybe I have looked at some of it wrong. And see, that's why in a jury room, well, you all get together and then hopefully come up with a consensus. But I know, and I do appreciate in this one, we will not have a consensus. There will be very, very differing views. But thank you all who have added so much to this already. I won't keep rambling. This has gone on long enough. I'm Owen. You've been watching The Pub Test, and we'll see you on the next one.